A racist and corrupt police officer slapped a young black boy in the face right in the middle of a courtroom, surrounded by judges, attorneys, and strangers. No one moved. The gavel didn't drop. The silence felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The courtroom lights didn't flicker, the cameras weren't rolling, and the people who should have spoken, didn't. The boy, barely 14, staggered back from the impact. His cheek flamed red. His lips trembled, not from fear, but from something deeper, confusion, shame, rage, all tangled into a knot in his chest. The reason? A phone. A brand new phone his mom had saved for months to buy him for his birthday. It was still in the box when the officer pulled it from his backpack, sneering, "No way, a kid like you can afford something like this. You steal this from one of ours?" And before the boy could answer, the slap came. Open hand. Full force. No warning. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He didn't run. But his eyes locked onto the officers with something that shook even that monster's soul for a split second, because that boy knew something. Something none of them did. Someone was coming. And when he walked through that door, everything was going to change. No one in that courtroom knew that across the city, miles away, a man was being briefed on a returning flight from a government facility, a man whose name carried weight in places civilians would never set foot in. A man who had been away for years, not by choice but by necessity, serving in the shadows of the nation's most dangerous missions. A man with a past so buried in secrecy that even high-ranking officials saluted when he entered the room. That man was the boy's father. And less than 20 minutes after that slap echoed across the courtroom walls, that man opened the doors. He didn't say a word at first. He just stood there, still in partial uniform, boots dusty, face unreadable. And yet the temperature in the room dropped. Not from fear, but from gravity. The type of presence that silences everything without trying. He looked at the judge, then the officer, then his son. And then, he saw the mark. A single, red fingerprint blazing across the boy's face like a scarlet insult. The officer scoffed, trying to reassert control. "This your kid?" he barked. "Better teach him some manners before he ends up where he belongs." But before he could finish that sentence, a voice cut through the room like a blade, calm, precise, unshakable. "Where he belongs, is the last place you'll ever stand again in uniform." The room erupted into chaos. But the man didn't move. He didn't have to. Everything was already in motion. That day, something bigger than an act of violence had happened. The slap was not just a moment, it was a symbol. Of a system too comfortable with silence. Of uniforms that shield guilt. Of power abused in plain sight. And what no one in that room realized was that the man who had just entered wasn't just a soldier. He was a strategist. He had spent years dismantling corrupt regimes overseas, and now, he would dismantle one right at home. Within days, files started to move. Confidential records. Internal affairs reports. Whispered complaints buried under paperwork. Every abuse, every incident, every covered-up offense that this officer had committed or been involved in began to surface. All connected. All strategic. All deliberate. And while the system had failed the boy, it was about to answer to his father. This wasn't going to be a fight of fists. It was going to be a war of reputations, legal strategy, public exposure, and unshakable resolve. The father didn't need revenge. He wanted something far more dangerous to a corrupt man, the truth, laid bare for the world to see. But that wasn't all. There was something deeper that drove this confrontation. A secret that had been hidden even from the son. A reason the father had disappeared for so long. A deal made in silence, a sacrifice kept in the dark, and a betrayal that would soon rise to the surface. Because the slap, as brutal as it was just the spark. The real fire? That was just getting started. Now the question is, what did that father uncover that shook the entire police department from the inside out? And how did the very system that protected the officer end up turning against him, in front of everyone? You think you know what happened after that door opened? Think again. Stay until the end. Because what happened to the racist officer shocked the entire country. Before we begin, a quick but important message to every black viewer watching this: we see you, we stand with you, and we support you. Here at Plow of Twist, we do not tolerate racism in any form. This channel is a space for stories that confront injustice and elevate voices that deserve to be heard. Now, sit back, take a breath. You're about to hear a story that may hit close to home, but trust me, it's worth it. Subscribe to the channel if you believe in truth, justice, and powerful storytelling. Enjoy the story. The courtroom in downtown Detroit was old, not in years but in feeling. It had that heavy silence baked into its walls, the kind that weighed down on the shoulders of anyone who walked in. Wood panels scarred by decades of trials, benches polished by the slow drag of desperate palms, ceilings too high to hear the thoughts bouncing between them. On most days, it was just another stop in the system, another hearing, another defendant, another bureaucratic process. But that day, everything would shift, and it all began with a boy and a phone. Malik Carter was only 14, but his eyes carried an intensity beyond his age. He wasn't the kind of kid who sought trouble, but trouble often knew where to find boys like him. Slim, quiet, observant, he was the kind of child who paid attention to the details adults ignored. That morning, he had been excited. His mother, Angela, had worked 2 shifts a day for nearly 4 months to get him the gift he'd been dreaming of, a brand new phone. Nothing flashy, just something reliable. Something his classmates had long taken for granted. She'd surprised him with it the night before, tears in her eyes as she placed the unopened box in his hands. It wasn't just a gift, it was a symbol. A declaration that no matter what the world tried to tell him, he was worthy. But that small victory shattered within hours. On his way to school, just a block from his front door, he was stopped by Officer Brett Langford. Langford was a name people in the neighborhood knew well. He was a cop who'd been around for years, moving with the confidence of someone who believed the badge gave him permission, not responsibility. He didn't patrol, he prowled. His reputation wasn't loud or covered in headlines, but it was whispered in barbershops, murmured at community meetings, exchanged in glances between parents walking their kids home. Everyone had a story. A traffic stop that turned aggressive. A late-night arrest that never made it to court. A look, a word, a threat. But Langford was smart enough to know how to stay clean on paper. When he stopped Malik that morning, it wasn't because of any call or complaint. It was instinct, the kind of instinct that has nothing to do with justice and everything to do with prejudice. He saw a young black boy with something new, and that was enough. He demanded to see what was in the box, and when Malik hesitated, confused, he grabbed it. "Where'd you get this?" Langford sneered. Malik explained. He tried to show the receipt tucked in his backpack. He tried to speak calmly. But it didn't matter. By the time Langford cuffed him, people had already gathered on the sidewalk, some filming quietly, most too afraid to interfere. Angela was waiting at the courthouse steps when they brought her son in. She had followed the patrol car all the way, barely holding herself together. She wasn't new to this nightmare. She'd grown up with brothers who had their own encounters with men like Langford, but nothing prepared her for seeing her son marched in like a criminal. She wasn't even allowed to hug him. The hearing wasn't supposed to be anything significant. A judge, a public defender, a short statement. But the tension was thick the moment Langford walked into the courtroom. He didn't just see Malik as a suspect. He saw him as a threat. Something about the boy's calm, his refusal to cower, ignited something in Langford that he couldn't name, but he could act on. And he did. When Malik stood to explain what happened, when he looked the judge in the eye and tried to speak his truth, Langford snapped. He accused the boy of lying. Claimed he resisted arrest. And when Malik, still handcuffed, said softly, "You're lying," Langford struck him. The sound was sharp. Flesh against flesh. The echo lingered longer than the pain. And everyone saw it. The judge. The clerk. The security officers. No one moved. Malik didn't fall. He didn't scream. But his lip bled, and his chest heaved. Not from fear, but from the weight of it all. The betrayal. The violation. The humiliation. Angela screamed, pushing past the rail, only to be restrained by 2 guards. And then, in the middle of that chaos, the courtroom doors opened. The man who stepped inside moved like someone who'd learned to make noise without a sound. Tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of frame that time and war carve out of men. His name was Andre Carter. To the outside world, he was a ghost, barely seen, rarely mentioned, often away. But in certain military circles, his name was said with the kind of respect reserved for legends. A former Special Forces operative, Andre had been part of missions most files redacted. He had trained allies, hunted enemies, and protected borders no one would ever know existed. And now, for the first time in 3 years, he was standing in front of his son, watching the blood on his lip, the fire in his eyes, and the man who'd put it there. Andre wasn't supposed to be back yet. His deployment had been extended twice. But something had shifted behind the scenes, an urgent recall, a favor owed, a last-minute reassignment. He hadn't even told Angela he was back. He wanted to surprise Malik that evening. He had a gift for him in his duffel bag, something from overseas. But what he walked into was not a homecoming, it was a reckoning. Langford, for all his arrogance, recognized the shift in the room. He tried to hide it, covering his insecurity with mockery. "You his daddy," he said, brushing his uniform as if the blood on Malik's face didn't matter. "Maybe if you were around, he wouldn't be in here." But he didn't expect the silence that followed. Not the silence of fear, but the silence before a storm. Angela, tears running down her face, tried to speak, but Andre raised a hand. Not to silence her, but to signal her he was here now. He walked to Malik slowly, knelt before him, wiped his lip gently with a cloth from his pocket. Then he stood, turned to the judge, and calmly said, "I'll represent my son." It wasn't a request. The courtroom hadn't seen anything like it before. A man who looked like a soldier, spoke like a diplomat, and moved like a shadow. Within minutes, Andre had requested access to body cam footage, demanded an immediate review of Langford's conduct, and challenged the court to justify why a child with proof of ownership was brought in at all. But this wasn't going to be about courtroom arguments. This was the beginning of something much bigger. Something years in the making. Andre had spent his life serving a country that failed his son in a matter of seconds. And now, every skill, every connection, every secret he held, he would use. Not to destroy, but to expose. Langford thought he was untouchable. He'd played the system long enough to know its cracks, to use its shadows. But he didn't know Andre Carter. And he didn't know that some shadows aren't empty. Some carry the weight of men who've seen too much to be afraid anymore. And behind Andre's calm, behind his sharp words and steady hands, there was something else. Something he hadn't even told Angela. A reason he was recalled early. A reason he had access to files that even high-ranking officials couldn't touch. A reason this wasn't just personal, it was strategic. But that part of the story, that part hasn't been told yet. Because this isn't just about a slap. It's about a reckoning. And it's only just begun. The house was quiet that evening, too quiet for a home that had just survived the collapse of everything it thought it could trust. Angela sat at the edge of the living room couch, fingers trembling around a chipped coffee mug she hadn't taken a sip from in over 20 minutes. Across from her, Malik stared at the floor with that same expression he had in the courtroom, not of fear or sadness, but a kind of silence that only kids forced to grow up too fast ever truly master. Andre stood near the window, his arms crossed, watching the night press against the glass, his mind running 1,000 miles ahead of his body. He hadn't even unpacked yet. His duffel bag was still by the door, untouched. His boots left a trail of dust across the hardwood. But nothing in that room mattered more than what he had seen on his son's face that day: humiliation, yes, but also a quiet challenge, as if Malik was daring the world to try and break him again. Angela finally spoke, her voice strained and dry. She said she wanted to believe things would get better after what happened in the courtroom, but the truth was she'd seen too many apologies that led to nothing. "They always say they'll investigate," she whispered, not even looking up. "But they just wait for the anger to die down. And then, they move on like nothing happened." Andre didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on the window, then turned, walking over slowly. He knelt down in front of Malik again, just like he had in the courtroom, and placed a hand on his knee. "We're not moving on," he said, calm but steady. "We're moving in." The next day, Andre didn't waste time. While Angela took Malik to a counselor, someone she trusted from the community center who specialized in trauma, Andre drove downtown, not to the courthouse, but to a building with no signs, no logos, just thick gray walls and security cameras that tracked every step. It was a federal building, one he had clearance to enter without invitation. He walked past the guards without showing ID. When he reached the elevator, he pressed a button that no civilian would ever see. Inside, he met with a man named Curtis, an old contact from his Special Forces days who now worked with internal affairs. Their history was layered with complications, but they had one thing in common: they hated dirty cops more than they feared bureaucracy. Curtis leaned back in his chair, scanning a report Andre had already compiled. Photos, timestamps, witness statements, even a partial clip from someone's phone that had captured the slap just moments before the bailiff blocked the view. Curtis didn't speak for a long time, then finally exhaled and muttered, "Langford's name has come up before. Complaints that mysteriously disappeared. Civilian statements that never turned into reports. But this is different." Andre nodded, his jaw clenched. "Because this time, it's not buried. This time, it's going to the surface." What Andre didn't tell Curtis, what he hadn't told anyone yet, was that he'd already started collecting more than just statements. He'd reached out to a few names from his past, people whose skills didn't appear on resumes and whose records were cleaner than their real lives. Through them, he got access to precinct files, officer movement logs, and body cam footage that had never made it to evidence. Piece by piece, he began to see the pattern: Langford wasn't a lone bad apple. He was a symptom. There were others like him, officers who fed off the same silence, who passed each other favors, who erased each other's sins behind coded language and procedural loopholes. Meanwhile, Malik returned to school, but it wasn't the same. Whispers followed him in the hallway. Some students treated him like a hero, others avoided him altogether, unsure how to act around someone whose face had been on the news. Teachers tried too hard or not enough. One even pulled him aside to say how brave he was, only to then suggest he avoid any further attention. Malik said little, but at night, in the dark, he'd lie in bed with eyes wide open, replaying the slap in slow motion, hearing his mom scream, seeing the officers sneer. One evening, after a tense dinner, Malik finally broke his silence. He asked Andre why he had come back early. Angela froze. Andre paused. There was a long silence before he answered. He said there were things happening overseas, things that forced the military to cut his tour short. But even as he said it, Malik's eyes searched for more. Andre didn't flinch, but the truth pressed against his tongue. There was more, much more, but the time to reveal it hadn't come yet. Days later, Curtis sent Andre a package. Inside was a printed log of internal investigations, names, dates, closed files. Langford's record had been sanitized. Complaints were either withdrawn or resolved internally. But one name appeared twice, an officer named Halloran, who had once partnered with Langford. The first complaint involved excessive force against a teenager during a traffic stop. The second, A wrongful arrest in a robbery case. Both incidents mysteriously settled with no follow-up. Andre tracked down the teenager from the first case. He was 22 now, working at a car wash, hesitant to talk. But when he saw the footage of Malik's hearing, he sat down and didn't stop talking for 2 hours. Every conversation Andre had, every door he knocked on, added weight to his mission. He wasn't just protecting his son anymore. He was dismantling a system from the inside. And he wasn't doing it loudly. He was building something slow, deliberate, impossible to stop once it started. Angela, at first unsure, began to see the plan forming. She helped gather witnesses, reached out to community leaders, organized meetings. The family, broken by that slap, was now galvanized by it. But Langford? He wasn't standing still. Rumors began to spread that he was preparing his defense. That he'd hired a powerful attorney with connections in the prosecutor's office. That he'd claimed the slap was in self-defense. That he was preparing a counter-narrative, that Malik had threatened him, that the boy had made a sudden movement, that there had been visible aggression. The lies started to take shape. And Andre knew that if they weren't destroyed early, they would become truth in the court of public opinion. One night, Angela found Andre alone in the garage, sitting on an old crate with a file in his hand. She asked him what he was looking at. He told her he'd just received something. A personnel file. Not Langford's, his own. It was from an old operation, one that had gone sideways. Something that had been buried, sealed. And now, someone had leaked it. Angela's face went pale. She asked him who had access to it. Andre didn't answer. He didn't need to. The answer was clear, someone was trying to scare him. But they didn't understand. You don't scare a man who's already died 1,000 deaths to protect what he loves. As the court date approached, media attention grew. Community protests swelled. People who once whispered about Langford were now shouting. And yet, Andre kept moving in silence. There was still one piece missing. One name. One report that had vanished years ago. A report filed by a rookie cop about misconduct in the same precinct. That rookie? Gone. Quit the force. Disappeared. Until Andre found her. She agreed to meet, reluctantly. They sat in the back of a diner, faces hidden beneath baseball caps. She told him everything, how her report was buried, how she was threatened, how she left because she knew she was next. She gave him a copy of the report. Andre read it 3 times that night. And what he saw in those pages changed everything. Because the truth wasn't just about Langford. It was about what connected him to people far higher up. And now, as the court date draws near, the stage is set. The lies are unraveling. The silence is breaking. But what happens in that courtroom next, will shake the entire city. And what Andre Carter is about to reveal, about Langford, about the system, about himself, will leave everyone speechless. The morning of the hearing came with a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather. Andre stood in the hallway outside the courtroom, dressed in a simple black suit, nothing flashy, nothing attention-seeking. Angela sat beside Malik on the bench, her hand on his shoulder, her eyes never leaving the courtroom door. There was no press swarm this time. No cameras. The courthouse had issued a restriction order to minimize outside interference, but everyone in that building knew exactly what was at stake. Inside those walls, the truth was loaded like a weapon, waiting for someone to pull the trigger. Langford arrived 10 minutes late, his posture just a little stiffer than usual. He wore a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes and walked like a man convinced this would all pass, like every other scandal he'd slithered past. His lawyer, a sharp-jawed man in an expensive gray suit, walked beside him, flipping through a tablet like none of it mattered. When they passed Andre in the hall, Langford didn't make eye contact. He didn't have to. The air shifted. It wasn't fear. It was pressure. Like gravity had thickened around him. Inside the courtroom, it was standing room only. Rows filled with quiet murmurs. Lawyers, community leaders, a few high-ranking officials scattered in the crowd. The judge, a stern woman with decades of law on her face, called the session to order. She addressed the court with authority, not drama. No emotion in her voice. Only control. The charges were read quickly. Excessive force. Abuse of authority. Misconduct. The defense requested a motion to dismiss based on insufficient evidence. André stood. Calmly. Deliberately. Your Honor, he began, I ask the court to allow full presentation of the body cam footage, witness testimonies, and newly uncovered internal affairs documents which suggest a pattern of concealed misconduct. The judge studied him, then nodded. She granted the motion to proceed. That's when everything began to unravel. Curtis was first to take the stand. He spoke as a federal analyst, not as André's friend. He laid out timelines, records of complaints filed and mysteriously closed, internal memos stamped, confidential, without legal cause, and patterns of erasure that pointed to not just negligence, but orchestration. Langford's lawyer objected several times. Each time, the judge overruled him. Then came the footage. Not just of the courtroom slap, which was already public, but a series of body cam clips from Langford's past stops. Unedited. Undistorted. They showed a consistent tone, hostile, condescending, needlessly aggressive. One clip in particular silenced the room. It was from 2 years prior. A young boy, handcuffed, bleeding. Langford's voice loud, taunting. That boy wasn't Malik. His name was Isaiah Green. And he was in the gallery now. When the clip ended, Isaiah stood up without being called, walked to the center aisle, and said, without being asked, he told me I looked like someone who was born to be locked up. Then he threw me against the car. I was 12. The room held its breath. But that wasn't the end. André walked to the center with a manila folder. He opened it, took a single sheet of paper, and handed it to the judge. It was the missing report, the one filed by the rookie officer who had vanished years ago. But it wasn't just the report that mattered. It was what it referenced. A joint operation. One Langford had participated in off the books. One that led to a botched arrest, a civilian injury, and falsified paperwork. That operation had been protected by a chain of command. Until now. The judge asked who signed off on the report. André paused. His eyes locked with Langford's. Then he said one name. Assistant Chief Wallace. The courtroom exploded. Not literally, but in gasps, shocked expressions, frantic whispering. Wallace wasn't just a figurehead. He was a power player, someone who had brokered deals behind closed doors, maintained alliances with certain officers, and buried problems before they reached daylight. The revelation didn't just implicate Langford. It pierced the entire structure. Langford stood up suddenly, his face reddening. He shouted that it was all lies. That this was a setup. That André had a personal vendetta. The judge ordered him to sit down. He didn't. So 2 bailiffs moved toward him. But before they could touch him, André stepped forward and said quietly, "You should stop talking before you start confessing to things you can't walk back." Langford froze. Because in that moment, something changed. André pulled out one last file. It wasn't thick. Just a single sheet. A signed statement, Langford's own handwriting. From his rookie year. A witness report. One that revealed he had knowingly arrested the wrong person during a robbery investigation because, quote, the kid had that look. The judge read it silently. Then looked at Langford. And for the first time, she didn't see an officer. She saw a liability. Langford's lawyer asked for a recess. The judge denied it. She called for an immediate review of the evidence presented, scheduled an emergency inquiry into Assistant Chief Wallace, and ordered Langford to be detained pending further investigation. The courtroom stood still. As Langford was led away, he turned to Andre, eyes wide, mouth twisted, not in rage, but disbelief. Because he had spent his entire career surrounded by silence. And now, it was gone. Angela exhaled for the first time in hours. Malik didn't smile. He just leaned against her, his body finally relaxing, as if the weight had lifted, even if just a little. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Not to protest, but to watch. And when Andre stepped through the doors, they didn't cheer. They didn't chant. They simply parted to let him pass, with quiet nods and knowing eyes. But Andre knew something else. This wasn't over. Because Wallace had connections. And some of those connections were already moving behind the scenes. Trying to patch the cracks. Trying to rewrite the narrative before the next headline hit. But Andre wasn't walking away. Not yet. Because there was one more piece he hadn't shared. A secret buried so deep, it hadn't even been touched by everything he'd revealed. And that secret would burn the rest of the system to the ground. The hallway outside the courtroom was no longer filled with whispers. Now, it was filled with stares. Some were wide-eyed, stunned by the revelations that had unfolded just minutes before. Others were calculating, cautious, as if their minds were already racing to assess what this exposure meant for them, for their jobs, their alliances, their secrets. Andre didn't stop to look at any of them. He moved with the quiet precision of a man who wasn't surprised, not because he expected everything to go exactly as planned, but because he had lived long enough to know that truth never landed soft. It landed hard. It cracked things open. And what spilled out was never pretty. Angela held Malik's hand as they stepped outside, her grip tight but trembling. She hadn't cried inside the courtroom. Not once. She'd stayed composed, strong, anchored. But now, under the weight of release and justice and uncertainty all crashing at once, her voice cracked when she said, "I can't believe they actually took him." Andre looked at her, his jaw tight, and said, "They had no choice, not after what we put on the record." Malik, who had been quiet the entire time, suddenly stopped walking. He looked up at his father and asked, "Is it really over?" Andre crouched down in front of him, his voice low, not cold, but sharp with the truth. "No," he said. "Not even close." Later that night, they gathered in the kitchen. Angela made tea. Not because anyone wanted it, but because it gave her hands something to do. Malik sat at the table, his backpack untouched beside him. The house felt like it was holding its breath. Andre stood near the counter, staring at his phone, the screen glowing with a contact he hadn't dialed in years. Angela asked him what he wasn't telling them. He didn't answer immediately. Then he slid the phone into his pocket and turned around. "There's something I didn't bring into court," he said. "Something bigger than Langford. Bigger than Wallace." Angela narrowed her eyes. "Bigger how?" Andre paused. He took a breath. Years ago, during one of his classified assignments, he stumbled upon a domestic data sharing protocol, one that allowed certain federal departments to exchange sealed records with law enforcement precincts under the table. It wasn't illegal, but it wasn't exactly ethical. Through it, precincts could flag individuals as potential threats based on profile patterns, not charges. One of those flagged profiles. His own son. Before Malik had ever been in trouble, before he'd even hit double digits, his name had been tagged in a system used for preemptive behavioral tracking. Why? Because of Andre's military service, because of where they lived, and because Malik's school records included a suspension when he was 9 for disruptive behavior, a fight he didn't even start. Angela dropped her cup. It shattered on the floor. Her breath hitched as she stared at her husband. "You're saying they were watching our son before he even did anything?" Andre nodded slowly. Yes. That's why Langford targeted him. It wasn't just racism. It was data. A system feeding bias with algorithms and code and checkboxes. Langford acted on instinct, but the instinct was validated by something hidden, something no parent ever had a chance to challenge. Malik looked between them, stunned. He didn't fully understand all the pieces, but he understood enough. He asked the question that had been sitting in the air like smoke. So, they were planning to hurt me? Even if I didn't do anything? Andre walked over to him, knelt, and looked him in the eye. They didn't plan to hurt you. But they made it easier for someone to justify it when it happened. Malik swallowed hard. He didn't cry. But something changed in his face. A wall. A shift. Like the last part of innocence peeled away and what was left behind was something sharper. Andre explained that Wallace had authorized the precinct's access to this program. Not just for Malik, but for dozens of kids across the city. Black kids. Latino kids. Some flagged as young as 6 years old. Some had already been funneled into the juvenile system. It was a pattern. A mechanism. And Wallace wasn't the only name on it. Angela's voice broke when she asked, "Why didn't you tell me this before?" Andre's hands dropped to his sides. "Because I needed to make sure we had proof. I couldn't let you carry this weight if it turned out to be speculation. I couldn't let it break you too early." Angela shook her head, her eyes wide, her voice rising. "Don't you get it? It's already broken us. It's been breaking us for years, we just didn't see it." Andre stepped closer. "Then let's finish it. Let's burn the whole system down." The next day, he called a meeting with Curtis. Not in the federal building, but in a neutral space, a private office owned by an old friend, now a journalist. They sat across from each other with 2 laptops, both secured. Andre showed him the data, IDs, timestamps, confirmation of Wallace's authorization. Curtis's face changed. He asked Andre what he planned to do with it. Andre didn't blink. "I'm going public," he said. Curtis leaned back. "You're going to war?" Andre nodded. "Then let it be war." Curtis helped him build a release, timed perfectly, cross-posted, backed with documentation, survivor testimonies, expert commentary. Not a leak. A strike. They chose midnight, the next day. A digital bomb, designed not just to expose Wallace, but to ignite an investigation that couldn't be buried. By morning, it was everywhere. News outlets, social media, internal government emails, everyone saw the truth. Wallace resigned before noon. By sunset, an emergency council meeting had been called. Community leaders demanded a full audit of the police department, of the surveillance program, of every arrest made using data from those secret protocols. Langford, still in holding, had no chance to recover. His lawyer quit. He faced new charges, falsifying reports, targeting minors based on flagged bias, obstruction of justice. Andre didn't go to the press. He didn't speak at rallies. He stayed home with his family. But when reporters stood outside his house, he didn't hide either. He stepped onto the porch and said just one sentence. "They tried to silence my son. Now they have to listen." Inside, Malik watched the coverage on the TV, his fingers clenched around the same phone that had started everything. He looked at Angela, then at Andre. His voice was low but firm when he asked, "What happens now?" Andre didn't answer right away. Because even he didn't fully know. But something told him, the next part of this story would change everything. The days that followed were anything but quiet. As the investigation widened and Wallace's resignation sent shockwaves through City Hall, a vacuum opened, one filled with questions, tension, and fear. For the first time in decades, the public saw the blueprint of a system they had always suspected but never had proof of. Anonymous sources began stepping forward. A retired officer revealed he had been pressured to change the language in several juvenile reports. A school counselor shared documents showing how certain students were flagged for future behavioral risk, based on nothing more than neighborhood and attendance patterns. One former city official admitted on record that she had been aware of the data sharing program but was told it was safeguarded, only to be used in the event of terrorist threats. But terrorism, apparently, looked a lot like black kids with ambition. Andre was pulled into more meetings, not by choice, but by necessity. The mayor's office reached out, then federal agents, then activists. Everyone wanted his voice. Some wanted it to validate their outrage. Others wanted it to calm the storm. He attended a few, but his message remained the same: this isn't about one bad cop or one corrupt official. It's about the entire structure that made their actions possible. Every conversation seemed to come with an agenda. A trade. A position. A title. He refused them all. But what bothered him most weren't the power plays. It was the subtle suggestions, words like reconciliation, healing, moving forward. As if exposure alone was enough. As if the trauma Malik carried would somehow fade because people finally saw what had been done. Andre couldn't accept that. He knew what people meant when they said, move forward. It meant, stop making us uncomfortable. Malik, meanwhile, faced a world that now recognized him, not as a kid, but as a symbol. Everywhere he went, people knew who he was. Some clapped him on the back. Others gave him a solemn nod. Teachers suddenly treated him like he was fragile. Students looked at him with a strange mix of admiration and distance. At first, he tried to embrace it. He gave a few interviews, wrote a short essay for a local newspaper. But the pressure to represent, to carry everyone's pain like a banner, became suffocating. One night, sitting in the living room while the news blared headlines with his name, he turned to Andre and asked quietly, "Why does everyone think I have the answers? I'm just a kid." Andre sat beside him, put a hand on his back, and said, "Because you stood your ground in front of people who never expected you to." Malik stared at the TV, then said, "I didn't ask to be brave." Andre replied, "I know. But you were anyway. And that scares them more than anything else." Angela had changed too. There was something harder in her voice now, something less forgiving. At a city forum, she confronted the superintendent of schools and demanded a full audit of disciplinary data across the district. When he stammered through vague promises, she leaned in and said, "My son bled for your silence. I won't let another child do the same." The crowd erupted in applause. She left the building with a list of names who wanted to help. For the first time in her life, Angela wasn't just speaking as a mother. She was becoming a force of change, and there was no turning back. But as their influence grew, so did the consequences. Andre received threats. Subtle ones at first, strangers watching from cars parked across the street, phones ringing once then going silent. Then more direct, an envelope left in their mailbox containing photos of Andre during overseas operations, images that were never meant to be seen by the public. He knew what they meant. They were reminders. Warnings. There are things in your past we can expose too. That night, he sat alone in the garage again, staring at the photos. Angela found him, took one look, and said, "They think we'll run." Andre looked up, eyes steady. "Then they don't know us." What haunted Andre more than any of it was the decision he now had to make. Curtis had come to him with a proposal. A full federal inquiry was being planned. Andre's data, his files, his testimony could be the foundation of the entire case. But there was a cost. To go public, to truly testify in court and before Congress, he'd have to unseal everything, including missions he had been sworn to secrecy on, alliances that could compromise ongoing operations, even actions taken in the name of national security that he wasn't proud of. The exposure would bring down the system, but it would destroy his own legacy. Curtis warned him plainly, "If you do this, there's no coming back. You'll lose everything you've built." Andre replied, then maybe it was never worth building in the first place. But he didn't decide immediately. Instead, he spent a day with Malik. Just the two of them. No cameras, no questions, no headlines. They drove outside the city, walked through a wooded park, skipped stones across a silent river. Malik asked him what war was like. Andre didn't answer directly. Instead, he told him a story, about a village that had no weapons, but every night they placed mirrors on the hills so the enemy would think there were more soldiers than there really were. They didn't fight with guns. They fought with the idea of strength. Malik was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Are we the village?" Andre smiled. "No. We're the mirror." Later that evening, back at home, Angela brought up something that had been sitting on her chest. She asked Andre if he ever regretted serving. He paused, then said, "I regret that the country I served didn't protect you while I was gone. That's what I regret." Angela nodded, tears in her eyes, and whispered, "Then let's make sure it never happens again." That night, Andre made his decision. He called Curtis. He agreed to testify. The days ahead would be brutal. Depositions, cross-examinations, press attacks, political spin. Everything he feared would come to pass. But Andre didn't flinch. Not because he wasn't afraid, but because he had finally reached the point where fear didn't get to make the decisions anymore. Malik began writing. Not just essays, but poems. Letters to other kids. Speeches. He didn't do it for the cameras. He did it because he finally had words for the weight he carried. Angela formed a coalition of mothers who had experienced similar injustices. They met weekly, shared stories, organized legal aid. What started as one family's nightmare was becoming something much larger, a movement rooted in truth, rage, and hope. But not everyone saw it that way. Some leaders tried to co-opt the momentum, turn it into slogans and funding campaigns. Others tried to discredit Andre, painting him as a disgruntled veteran, suggesting he was unstable, that his motives were personal. When one official on a national news segment suggested that Andre's trauma from combat made him overly aggressive toward law enforcement, Andre didn't respond publicly. But privately, he told Malik, "The only aggression I ever showed was in defense of the people I love. And if that's a crime, they can write it on my grave." As the court date for the federal hearing approached, the family stood at the edge of something irreversible. Andre's full record would be unsealed. Malik's testimony would be read into the record. Angela would speak before a panel of elected officials. Every decision they had made, every truth they had exposed, had brought them here. But none of them were ready for what would be revealed next. Because the final piece of this puzzle, the thing that would burn through every defense, every excuse, every lie, was still waiting in silence. And when it came to light, it wouldn't just shake the courtroom. It would shake the country. In the final days before the federal hearing, tension settled into the Carter household like a permanent shadow. It wasn't just anxiety or nerves, it was the weight of what they were about to do, the understanding that they were no longer just witnesses to a crime, but catalysts of a reckoning. Each member of the family carried it differently. Angela kept herself busy, organizing documents, making sure they had everything in order, calling and recalling the women from her coalition to ensure they were ready to stand beside her at the courthouse. Malik became quieter, more introspective. He had grown up fast in the months since the incident, but this was different. This wasn't about processing what had been done to him anymore. Now, it was about choosing to speak, not because he had to, but because silence had never served him, and he refused to let it serve the ones coming after him. Andre, meanwhile, barely slept. He spent long hours at the kitchen table, poring over timelines, cross-referencing names, rereading every report, preparing for questions that would come from people whose goal was not truth, but deflection. His mind operated like a machine, precise, alert, constantly scanning for angles. But behind his composed exterior, something stirred deeper, something even he hadn't allowed himself to admit. Curtis called late one night, voice low and tense. "There's been movement," he said. "Internal pushback." The Department of Justice was hesitating. Not on the hearing itself, it would happen. But on the scope. Certain names were being shielded. Agencies were worried about national implications. Andre asked him directly, "Are they trying to limit my testimony?" Curtis hesitated, then said, "They're trying to control the fallout." Andre didn't raise his voice. He didn't curse. He just said, "Then we go louder." Curtis sighed, "You know what that means." Andre replied, "I know exactly what it means." The next day, Andre met with a journalist, one he trusted, one who had earned his respect not through credentials but through integrity. She was young, ambitious, but careful with the truth. They met in a quiet cafe outside the city. Andre laid everything out, his full military background, the real purpose behind several black ops he had participated in, and the way certain domestic programs had intersected with those operations, including the data systems used against people like his son. The journalist listened, took notes, and asked hard questions. At the end of it, she looked him in the eyes and said, "If I print this, it'll be the end of your reputation in the service." Andre leaned back and said, "If I don't, it'll be the end of my son's future." "Publish it." Malik sat with his mother that same afternoon, flipping through a notebook where he had scribbled thoughts he hadn't dared speak aloud. Angela read one of them, her fingers tracing the words as her eyes filled with tears. It said, "Sometimes it feels like they don't hate me for what I've done. They hate me for surviving what they tried to do." She looked at him, trying to find words that wouldn't sound like lies. She told him he was brave, that what he was doing would help others, that the world needed to hear from someone like him. Malik stared at the floor and whispered, "I don't want to be someone like me. I just want to be a kid." Angela pulled him close, held him tight, and said, "You are, baby. You're still a kid. You're just living in a world that forgot how to protect you." Andre's article dropped the next day. It spread like wildfire. News outlets scrambled to verify the claims. Some dismissed it as sensationalism. Others treated it like a national security breach. But the core of it stuck. A decorated Special Forces veteran, once considered untouchable, had laid bare a system of surveillance, profiling, and buried misconduct that connected federal programs to local abuses. Wallace's name wasn't the only one mentioned. Several high-ranking officials, people long considered untouchable, were listed with dates, connections, actions they had authorized or ignored. The article didn't just confirm the rot. It mapped it. That night, Angela found Andre sitting alone in the dark. She asked him what he was thinking. He said, "I think I just started something I can't control." She knelt beside him, looked into his eyes, and said, "You didn't start this. They did. You just stopped pretending not to see it." He rested his head against hers, and for the first time in weeks, he let the silence linger, not as a burden, but as a space to breathe. The courthouse on the day of the federal hearing felt like a city of its own. Security was tight, protests echoed from blocks away, and a swarm of reporters circled the steps like vultures. Andre arrived with Malik and Angela by his side. No entourage. No legal team. Just family. Just truth. Inside, the panel of officials sat like stone statues, their expressions unreadable, their intentions buried beneath layers of protocol. Andre was called first. He walked to the podium and spoke without notes. He told them everything, not just the facts, but the human cost. He spoke of the night he came home to see blood on his son's face, the moment he realized the country he bled for had marked his child before he even had a chance to choose who he wanted to be. He ended with one sentence, "I would have died for my country, but I won't let it kill my son." Malik was called next. The courtroom shifted. Some lowered their eyes, some leaned in. Malik stood tall, his voice quiet but clear. He didn't rehearse. He didn't dramatize. He simply said what happened, how it felt, how the silence of adults around him was louder than the slap itself. He said, they called it discipline. But it felt like a warning. A message that I wasn't supposed to belong. And then, before he left the stand, he said something that silenced even the panel. He said, if I can survive this, maybe other kids won't have to. Angela spoke last. She wasn't a politician or a soldier or a strategist. She was a mother. And when she told them that she had spent nights wondering if she'd lose her son to violence or to despair, there wasn't a dry eye in the gallery. She said, I didn't raise my son to be a martyr. I raised him to live. To laugh. To dream. You don't get to take that from him and call it justice. The panel adjourned after hours of testimony. Reporters flooded the steps. The public waited. But the real impact came the next morning. Several officials named in Andre's article stepped down. A federal task force was launched. The data sharing program was suspended. And more importantly, conversations began in cities across the country, not just about Langford, not just about Wallace, but about systems, about silence, about what kind of country they wanted to be. But for Andre, Angela, and Malik, the fight wasn't over. They returned home to find their mailbox stuffed with letters. Some were thank yous. Some were hate mail. But one envelope stood out, unmarked, plain, no return address. Inside was a flash drive. Andre plugged it into his laptop. A single video file appeared. It was security footage. Old. Grainy. A police briefing room. And in it, Wallace, speaking directly, confidently, explaining how the profiling system was an effective deterrent for future crimes. He used phrases like behavioral targeting and data-adjusted community control. It wasn't just policy. It was confession. And someone had kept it all this time. Andre closed the laptop slowly. Looked at Angela. Then Malik. He said, this is the last piece. Because what this video could do wasn't just bring justice. It could change the entire playbook. And they had a choice. Use it, and bring the whole house down. Or bury it, and protect themselves. The dilemma had arrived. And now, the final decision would define the future, not just of their family, but of everyone who had ever been told to sit down, be quiet, and survive. They weren't just witnesses anymore. They were the storm. The flash drive sat in the center of the kitchen table like it carried a pulse. Angela stared at it without blinking, her hands folded tightly in front of her, jaw clenched so hard it trembled slightly. Malik leaned forward with his elbows on the table, eyes locked on the laptop screen still glowing from the paused video. Andre stood behind them both, arms crossed, unmoving. The room was wrapped in a silence so thick it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Outside, traffic hummed faintly in the distance, life continued as usual, unaware that inside this modest home, the weight of a nation's secrets pressed against the shoulders of a single family. Angela finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. This is proof. Not speculation, not witness testimony, this is Wallace admitting it himself. We can end it, right here. Malik turned slowly to look at her, his voice shaking but firm. Or we start something else. Something we can't control. Andre exhaled, stepped forward, and sat down across from them. His voice was steady, but there was tension in his shoulders, as if his entire body was caught in the grip of a decision too heavy to carry alone. This video won't just expose Wallace. It's going to take down everyone who knew, everyone who covered it up, everyone who played a part in keeping this alive. That includes politicians, senior officers, even a few people I served with. The fallout won't stop at the precinct. It won't even stop at the state. This will go federal. National. Angela stared at him. And what's the other option? That we just sit on it? Bury it? Let them rebuild and pretend like they weren't caught red-handed? Andre didn't answer immediately. He looked at Malik instead. What do you think? Malik blinked, surprised that the question was coming to him. I think they always count on us being afraid. On us protecting ourselves instead of calling them out. I think they've built an entire system on the idea that we won't push too hard, won't make them bleed, because we're too tired or too scared or too broken. He paused, eyes dropping to the table. But I also know that once this is out, we don't get to be normal again. I'll never go to school without people thinking I'm dangerous or that I brought down the department. You'll never get to be just a veteran. Mom will always be the woman who exposed the system. I don't think we come back from that. Angela reached for his hand across the table, held it tightly. Maybe we don't come back from it. But maybe we're not supposed to. Maybe coming back means accepting a version of the world that isn't worth returning to. Maybe we're supposed to burn the whole thing down and build something new. Andre closed his eyes for a long moment, the quiet stretching out like a thread pulled too tight. Then he reached for the laptop, closed the lid gently, and said, I need to talk to someone before we decide. Later that night, Andre drove alone to the outskirts of the city, to a small, worn-down building that used to be a veteran support center. It was closed to the public now, but he still had a key, one of the few things he'd kept from the days when he still believed systems could be saved from the inside. Inside, he met with Elijah, a former commanding officer turned whistleblower, a man who had once risked everything to stop a cover-up overseas. They hadn't spoken in years, not since the fallout. Elijah looked older, tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. They sat in folding chairs across from each other, no ceremony, no formality. Andre showed him the video. Elijah watched in silence. When it ended, he didn't speak right away. Then he said, if you release this, they'll try to make you the story. They'll shift the focus off Wallace and onto you. They'll paint you as unstable, vengeful, dangerous. Andre nodded. I know. Elijah leaned forward. And if you don't release it, you'll carry it forever. Andre met his eyes. I've carried worse. Back home, Angela and Malik stayed up, neither willing to go to bed without knowing what Andre would choose. Malik paced the hallway, restless, speaking in fragments that Angela listened to without interrupting. He talked about how tired he was of being a symbol, of having to explain his existence, of feeling like every step he took was already being watched. He talked about wanting to disappear, and then about wanting to scream so loudly the whole world had to stop and look. Angela listened, nodding quietly, and then finally said, you don't have to decide what you are today. You just have to be true. That's enough. When Andre returned, the three of them sat down again, just like before. No dramatic declaration. No theatrics. Just a family with a choice. Andre placed a single sheet of paper on the table. It was a statement he had written in the parking lot of the Veterans Center. It said simply, the video will be released. We will accept the consequences. But the truth belongs to the people now. Angela read it silently, then nodded once. Malik looked at his father, and in that moment, something shifted between them, not just father and son, but equals. Fighters in the same war. They didn't send it to the press. They uploaded it directly. No middleman. No filter. The video, along with Andre's statement, went live at 7 a.m. the next morning. Within 30 minutes, it had over 300,000 views. By noon, Wallace was trending worldwide. Government officials scrambled for statements. News anchors struggled to find language that wouldn't incite panic or backlash. But the truth had already detonated, and there was no stopping the blast. Backlash came fast. Supporters flooded their social media with messages of gratitude, calling them heroes. But threats came too. Death threats. Accusations of treason. Politicians calling for Andre's arrest. Malik's school called to say they couldn't guarantee his safety and suggested remote learning, until things settled down. Angela received an anonymous voicemail that said, hope the truth keeps you warm when everything else burns. She played it once, deleted it, and poured herself a cup of tea like nothing happened. That night, the three of them sat on the couch, wrapped in the strange stillness that comes when you know the world is watching but you've already said everything there is to say. Malik broke the silence first. "You think they'll arrest us?" Angela shrugged. "Maybe." Andre answered, "They'll try to make examples of us." "But they already did. We're the example they didn't want." The next morning, the Department of Justice announced the formation of an independent commission to investigate the entire surveillance initiative that Wallace had admitted to on video. Several federal officials were placed on administrative leave. State prosecutors launched new cases. Community leaders demanded permanent change, not temporary scandal control. But even as the machinery of accountability began to grind forward, the Carters knew it was far from over. Andre's military record was brought up in public hearings. Senators asked pointed questions about his mental health, about decisions made during classified missions. News outlets ran old photos of him in combat gear with headlines designed to stir doubt. Angela was portrayed in op-eds as emotionally reactive, politically motivated, an opportunist. Malik was discussed on TV panels by people who had never met him, debating whether he was truly mature enough to understand what he'd been through. And still, they stayed silent. Not because they had nothing left to say, but because they had already said it. Loudly. Truthfully. Irrevocably. One night, after dinner, Malik pulled a small notebook from his backpack and handed it to his father. "I've been writing again," he said. Andre opened it, scanned the first few pages, then looked at his son. "These are good." Malik shrugged. "Maybe someone else will read them one day." Andre nodded. "Maybe they will. But even if they don't, you wrote them. That's power." Angela joined them on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, sipping tea. They looked out at the street, quiet now, almost deceptively peaceful. She said, "Do you think they'll remember us in 10 years? Andre leaned back. "I think they'll remember that someone stood up." That someone said no more. Malik looked up at the sky, then said, "I hope they remember the truth." The house didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt like a fortress. Not because it was protected, but because everyone inside had made peace with the storm. They weren't waiting for safety. They were living in truth. And they weren't done yet. Months passed. The world didn't end. But something shifted. The city changed, not in grand, sweeping transformations that filled headlines, but in the quiet adjustments that signal the start of something real. The program was dismantled. Wallace, indicted and exposed, pled guilty under pressure and struck a deal that implicated multiple others, dragging the shadows of the system into the light. His fall wasn't dignified or dramatic. It was slow, hollow, and public, a reminder that silence is not armor. Other resignations followed, and with them, long-awaited investigations. Reforms were proposed, some passed, some stalled. But the fear that had once silenced victims had cracked, and in its place came voices, loud, determined, unwilling to be ignored. Malik transferred to a new school on the other side of town, not because he was running from what had happened, but because he wanted space to grow without constantly reliving it. There, he found calm, not freedom from scrutiny, but space to be a teenager. He joined the debate team, not for competition, but for the art of choosing words and wielding them like tools. He began sharing his writing publicly through a student-led publication focused on social justice. Teachers didn't look at him like a victim or a symbol, they saw him as a mind in motion. He smiled more. Not always, but enough. One afternoon, after reading one of his essays aloud in class, a younger student came up to him and said, "You made me feel like I matter." And for the first time in a long time, Malik felt like his pain hadn't just survived, it had planted something. Angela's coalition evolved into a full-scale nonprofit, with funding from grassroots donors and support from national civil rights organizations. Mothers from across the country reached out, some looking for support, others looking to join. She traveled, spoke at conferences, sat on panels, and helped write new legislative proposals centered around accountability in school discipline and juvenile justice. She never sought the spotlight, but when it found her, she used it with precision and purpose. Late at night, when the house was quiet and her laptop glowed with research and correspondence, she would pause and remember the helplessness she once felt. Then she'd lean forward and keep going, knowing that somewhere, another mother was waiting to feel seen. Andre Carter's decision to release the video did exactly what he expected. It ended his military career, tarnished his service record, and erased every chance of stepping back into any government role. But the cost didn't shake him. Because in its place came something far greater. He was asked to testify again, this time not in defense of his own family, but to help construct a new federal oversight committee tasked with regulating surveillance practices in law enforcement. He agreed, on the condition that the committee include civilians, especially those from communities most affected. His testimony helped frame a new transparency policy that would require law enforcement agencies to disclose all predictive data used to the public annually. The impact was slow, but undeniable. Andre didn't seek vindication. He wanted change. And in every city that passed a new policy, in every precinct forced to restructure, he found it. One day, Andre was invited to speak at a university symposium. The topic, the price of truth. He almost declined, but Malik encouraged him to go. Standing in that auditorium, in front of hundreds of students and professors, he spoke not as a soldier or a whistleblower, but as a father. He said, "I wasn't trained for this fight. I was trained to face threats from the outside. But what do you do when the danger is in your own backyard? You do the same thing. You defend. You refuse to bow. You raise your voice, even if it shakes. And you don't stop, because the truth, no matter how heavy, is always lighter than silence." On the drive home, Malik looked over from the passenger seat and said, "I think I want to be a lawyer." Andre didn't react right away. Then he smiled. Not because it was ambitious, but because it was perfect. Not a warrior like his father. Not a protester like his mother. But something forged in both. The Carters never asked to be symbols. They never intended to lead anything. But history doesn't wait for permission, it finds those who refuse to look away. And in their refusal, they didn't just hold the line. They moved it. Now, take a moment. Think about what you've just heard. Not as a story, but as a mirror. How many times have we seen injustice dressed up as law? How many names were buried under the silence of bureaucracy? How many children were told to sit still, be grateful, survive? And how many parents were forced to choose between safety and truth? Andre, Angela, and Malik didn't change the world with a single action. They changed it by standing firm, one painful step at a time. And the real question isn't whether their story is powerful. It's whether we have the courage to carry it forward. So ask yourself, what would you do if it were your child? Your family? Would you risk everything to speak truth to power? Or would you stay silent, hoping someone else would? You've reached the end of the story, but maybe it's just the beginning of something in you. If this tale moved you, if it made you reflect, if it made you angry, hopeful, or anything in between, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Talk about it. Carry it with you. And make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist, where stories aren't just told, they mean something. We'll be waiting for you in the next one.